Over the frozen fields of Belgium, the sky was alive with engines, smoke, and the echo of distant artillery. Lieutenant Ed Catrell, barely 22, gripped the controls of his P-47 Thunderbolt, a massive fighter bomber nicknamed Our Mary, as oil streaked across his windshield and the engine coughed violently. Around him, enemy fighters sliced through the clouds, diving for the kill. In those moments, every heartbeat stretched into an eternity. Ed knew with chilling certainty that the next 30 seconds might be his last. The Ardennes was in chaos. German tanks pushed forward with ruthless precision, aiming to split Allied lines and seize Bastogne, a town whose capture could have turned the tide of the war. The 493rd Fighter Squadron, Ed's unit, was the only thing standing between the town and a wave of destruction. The Grim Reapers, stationed at Santron Airfield, had flown countless missions, but that day felt different. The sky itself seemed to hum with danger. Ed's squadron of 12 P-47s cut through the cold air, bomb strapped. Beneath their wings, their engines roaring like a chorus of fury, they descended toward the German convoy with deadly purpose. Explosions rippled across the frozen landscape as the first wave released their payload. Then it was Ed's turn, diving for targets amidst the roar of wind and gunfire. A sudden crackle over the radio froze his blood. Messerschmitt's diving. Ambush. His squadron leader's voice barely made it through the static. From the clouds, the enemy descended fast, precise, and merciless. Ed's eyes widened as a German Bf 109 angled toward his leader. He warned his squadron, but the world seemed to collapse around him as a shell tore into his engine. Oil sprayed across his windshield in a blinding black sheet. The massive Pratt and Whitney engines sputtered, gasped, and began to die. His P-47, a 14,000-pound thunderbolt of war, was now a crippled beast barely holding itself aloft. He fought to keep control, opening the canopy for visibility, praying for guidance, trying to chart a path back to friendly lines. The air was filled with the shriek of engines, the rattle of machine guns, and the scent of burning oil. Ed's pulse raced as he glanced to the right, an enemy fighter, a Bf 109, maneuvering in perfect position for the kill. To his left, another. The Germans circled, their wings slicing the sky like blades. Ed braced himself. Death felt inevitable, but then something unthinkable happened. Instead of unleashing fire, the two German planes fell into formation alongside him. Wingtip to wingtip, they flanked his crippled Thunderbolt, almost like guardians. Ed's mind raced. They could easily destroy him. Every instinct screamed to expect bullets, flames, and the end. Yet the sky remained eerily quiet around him. For minutes that felt like hours, the three planes moved together over the Belgian countryside field. Blanketed in snow, tiny villages nestled among forests, rivers glinting in the weak winter sun. Ed realized with stunned awe that the enemy pilots weren't attacking. They were shielding him. Each motion, each adjustment of their wings, kept him safe from others who might still strike. When the boundary between German and Allied lines approached, the pilots signaled a small circle with their fingers, a silent gesture of good luck. Then they banked, peeling back into enemy skies, leaving Ed alone with a battered plane, and a story that would haunt and mystify him for the next 79 years. Alone, he navigated towards Santron Airfield, guided only by instinct and the faint voice of a ground controller. The runway stretched before him like salvation, but the engine groaned in protest. At the last possible moment, the propeller ceased entirely, and Ed executed a death stick landing, skidding across the icy tarmac before finally coming to a stop. He climbed from the cockpit, legs shaking, knees hitting the ground in relief and disbelief. He had survived. Around him the war raged on. His close friend, Second Lieutenant Art Summers, had not been so fortunate. He had been shot down in the same battle, leaving a void that Ed would carry for decades. Years passed. Ed Catrell lived a life of service, family, and honor, flying 65 combat missions, earning medals, serving in the Air Force Reserves, and eventually becoming a professor. Yet one question shadowed him through every milestone. Why had those German pilots spared him? Why mercy, when they could have taken a life so easily? In his later years, Ed returned to Europe, walking the battlefields, retracing the skies he had once flown, seeking answers among the silent villages and frozen forests of Belgium. It was historian Paul Oshner who eventually unlocked the mystery, connecting old combat records and revealing the identity of one of the German pilots who had escorted him to safety. On December 23, 2023, at age 102, Ed stood at the crash site in Bonn, Germany. Across from him, Karl Bossi Bosse, the former enemy fighter pilot, now 99, faced him. Decades of uncertainty dissolved as the two men shared stories, memories, and understanding of that harrowing day. Bosser explained their choice. The war was ending, victory was inevitable, and killing a defenseless young pilot would serve no purpose. Their mercy was born not from fear but from humanity. After 4 hours at the site, the two men embraced, no longer enemies, but friends, bound by a shared history that few could comprehend. "We are now friends," Ed said, "never enemies again." From the frozen skies over Belgium to a quiet reunion almost 8 decades later, mercy had bridged the gap between two men who once faced death as enemies. Some friendships are forged in peace, some are forged in the storm of war, in moments where choice, courage, and compassion collide. Ed Catrell returned to North Carolina, Carl Bosser to Germany. They kept in touch, calling across oceans, a living testament to the possibility of humanity amidst the horrors of war. The winter of 1944 was relentless. Snow drifted across the Ardennes, blanketing forests and fields in a stark, cold silence, broken only by the distant thunder of artillery and the scream of aircraft engines. Lieutenant Ed Catrell had barely caught his breath after landing at Santron Airfield. His hands still shook, and his mind replayed the impossible moment over the German pilots, so close, so ready to kill, yet choosing mercy. That memory, raw and vivid, stayed with him long after the war ended. Ed spent the rest of December flying more missions, each one a mix of fear and resolve. His P-47 Thunderbolt, sturdy and lethal, carried him through low-level strikes, strafing runs, and dogfights that tested every ounce of his skill. But no plane, no mission could match the terror and disbelief he had felt when 2 enemy fighters had flanked his crippled aircraft rather than firing. He often wondered what went through their minds, the young men behind the cold steel of their Bf 109 seconds. The war pressed on. Ed survived 65 combat missions, watched friends fall and saw the Ardennes gradually shift from a battlefield to a frozen graveyard. Each mission reinforced the brutal calculus of life and death in the air. Skill, speed, and luck could keep you alive for seconds longer, but survival was never guaranteed. For Ed, survival had been something more, a mysterious act of mercy that defied everything he'd learned about war. After the war, Ed married his college sweetheart, Millie, built a family, and pursued a long career in the Air Force Reserves. Yet, in quiet moments, the memory of that December day gnawed at him. He returned to Belgium in the 2000s, walking the same villages, tracing the frozen rivers, and revisiting the fields over which he had flown. He spoke with local historians, visited memorials, and examined aerial photographs from 1944, trying to piece together the identities of the pilots who had spared him. Historian Paul Oshner became Ed's guide through this puzzle. Specializing in the Battle of the Bulge and its air engagements, Oshner meticulously matched mission logs, combat reports, and aircraft serial numbers. Slowly, a picture emerged, an almost impossible connection across time. A link between Ed and one of the pilots who had escorted him to safety. Records pointed to Carl Bosser, a German fighter pilot who had been shot down later that same day, ejected from his burning plane, and survived serious injuries before returning to the skies. On December 23, 2023, 79 years after that frozen morning over Belgium, Ed, now 102, stood at the site where Bosser's plane had crashed. Across from him, Carl Bosser, 99, looked back, a mix of recognition, curiosity, and a lifetime of memories flickering in his eyes. They did not need interpreters to feel the weight of the past. The air was crisp, the sky overcast, and the silence of the forest seemed to hold its breath as two men who had once been mortal enemies finally faced each other. Through a translator, they shared the story of that day, the chaos of combat, the thrum of engine, the deafening roar of artillery, and the moment that had defined both their lives. Bosser explained that when he and his wingman spotted Ed's crippled P-47, they had made a conscious choice. He described the split-second calculation that changed everything. The war was nearly over, the outcome decided, and there was no need to kill a young pilot who could do nothing to alter the course of history. In that act, they had chosen mercy over victory. For Ed, it was the answer he had carried in his heart for nearly 8 decades. The fear, the wonder, the haunting question of why he had survived it all fell into place. This was not luck. It was human compassion in the middle of unimaginable destruction. The two men walked to site together, examining the remnants of metal and earth where lives had been risked and spared, piecing together the story that had waited 79 years to be told. By the end of the day, they embraced two former enemies, separated by oceans and decades, now connected by a profound understanding that transcended war. "We are now friends," Ed said. "Never enemies again." The gesture was more than symbolic. It was a reconciliation with the past, a recognition that even in the worst of humanity's darkest moments, there remained space for mercy, courage, and understanding. Ed returned to North Carolina, continuing his days with family, friends, and the veteran. Breakfast Club Zoom calls, sharing his story with anyone willing to listen. Karl Bosse went back to Germany, celebrated milestones with his family, and kept in touch with Ed, the two forming a bridge across time and experience, proving that even old adversaries can find connection, respect, and friendship. Their story is not just a tale of survival, it is a testament to the complexity of human choice in wartime, the possibility of compassion even in the midst of brutality, and the way a single act of mercy can echo across decades. From 2,000 feet over the snow-covered fields of Belgium to a quiet reunion nearly 80 years later, Ed Catrell and Karl Bosse's lives were forever intertwined by the fragile, astonishing, and enduring power of human kindness. Even after that reunion in 2023, the memories of December 17, 1944, never left Ed Catrell. Every winter, he thought of the frozen Belgian skies, the roar of engines, the smell of burning oil, and the impossible choice made by two young enemy pilots who could have ended his life in an instant. For him, it had been a moment suspended between life and death, a miracle in midair that shaped the rest of his existence. But for Karl Bosse, that day had been just another mission, a life-and-death decision made in the heat of battle, weighed in seconds, yet carried in his heart for decades without understanding its full impact. Bosse, like Ed, had been just a boy thrust into the machinery of war. At 20 he had joined the Luftwaffe, trained rigorously on the Bf 109, and been sent to defend his homeland from advancing Allied forces. His world had been a mix of strict discipline, relentless training, and an unyielding sense of duty. Yet, that morning over Belgium, as he dived from the clouds toward a damaged Thunderbolt, the usual rules of combat seemed to blur. The P-47 was barely moving, its engine sputtering, black oil streaming down the canopy. It was a sitting target, helpless, and yet somehow alive. Bosse would later recall that the sight stopped him in a way no enemy aircraft had before. His wingman, equally seasoned and ready to fire, sensed it too. They had approached with the instinct of trained killers, expecting to score another victory, to mark another confirmed kill. But then, something human intervened. Neither pilot could pull the trigger. There was no logical reason, no military advantage, no orders, but in that split second, they understood that destroying this young American would accomplish nothing. It would add a tally to their record. Yes, but it would also extinguish a life without purpose. So, they made a decision that neither of them could have predicted at the time. They became protectors instead of predators. They flanked Ed, keeping their planes close, wingtip to wingtip, as if to shield him from any other threats. The Thunderbolt's engine struggled, threatening to stall at any moment, yet they guided him, silently, toward the boundary where Allied forces waited. For Ed, it was a miracle. For Bosse, it was a choice born of instinct and some deeper compassion, perhaps, though he would not have named it that at the time. As the years turned into decades, Ed lived with the memory of that strange mercy. He would tell anyone who would listen, friends, fellow veterans, students, even strangers at lectures or veterans' breakfast club gatherings. "I owe my life to two men who were supposed to be my enemies," he would say. It was a story that always drew disbelief, even from those who had served in combat themselves. How could enemies trained, armed, and ready to kill choose life over death in the midst of war? It was not until Ed connected with historian Paul Oshner that the fog of mystery began to lift. Oshner had spent years studying the air battles over Belgium, analyzing every sortie, every crash, every report from that pivotal December. He was meticulous, methodical, and patient, piecing together fragments from nearly 80 years ago. When Ed told him the story of the two German pilots, Oshner's eyes lit up. He had encountered records suggesting a Bf 109 had been involved in escorting a damaged P-47 that day, a detail that had been buried in the chaos of combat reports. Through weeks of research, cross-referencing logs, flight plans, and aircraft serial numbers, Oshner finally pinpointed Karl Bosse, a man who had survived being shot down that same day, parachuted to safety, and continued to fly for the remainder of the war despite injuries. The puzzle pieces fell into place, connecting Ed and Bosse after nearly 8 decades. The realization was profound. The young man who had saved Ed's life in 1944 was still alive, and now they could meet. When Ed stood at the crash site near Bonn in December 2023, it was surreal. The landscape had changed over the years, yet the ghosts of the past lingered. Forests had grown, roads had shifted, but the earth still remembered the violence that had once torn through it. Across from him stood Karl Bosse, frail yet alert, his eyes holding a lifetime of memories. The two men studied each other, aware of the vast gulf of history that separated them, yet connected by a single extraordinary act. The conversation began haltingly, through translators, each man choosing words carefully, mindful of decades of distance and the weight of war. They spoke of planes, maneuvers, and the cold logic of combat. Then they spoke of what had happened that December morning. Bosse described the split-second decision, the glance exchanged with his wingman, the unspoken agreement to spare the American pilot. He admitted that for years he had wondered if that young man had survived, never knowing that the one he had saved had gone on to live a long, full life. Ed listened, the final pieces of his lifelong question falling into place. He had always imagined the Germans as faceless enemies, disciplined and ruthless, yet here was a man who had defied expectation, who had chosen something unexpected in the midst of chaos. "I finally understand," Ed whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "You gave me a chance to live, and that changed everything." For nearly 4 hours, the two men shared stories, each one revealing more about their lives, their families, and their wartime experiences. They traced the path of the planes, piecing together every maneuver, every near miss, every decision that had led to survival. They laughed at moments, winced at others, and fell into long silences, absorbing the gravity of a history they had once made unknowingly together. It was a reunion that transcended the battlefield. Two men who had once sought each other's deaths were now bound by a bond forged in mercy, courage, and the inexplicable human capacity for compassion. When they finally embraced, it was a gesture heavy with history, acknowledgement, and forgiveness. "We are now friends," Ed said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "Never enemies again." The story of Ed Catrell and Karl Bosse did not end in Germany. Across oceans, they continued to communicate, sharing birthdays, family milestones, and memories. Bosse celebrated his 100th birthday in January 2025, surrounded by family who marveled at the extraordinary journey of a man who had once flown in a war that consumed millions of lives. Ed passed away peacefully 2 months later at the age of 103, knowing that the mystery that had haunted him for nearly 8 decades had finally been resolved. Their tale is more than a story of survival. It is a testament to the complexity of war, fleeting but profound moments where humanity asserts itself in the face of destruction. It is a story of choices, of the courage it takes to defy orders or expectations, and of the ripples those choices create over lifetimes. The frozen skies over Belgium, once a theater of death and terror, became a symbol of possibility, a place where mercy can exist even when all else seems lost. Historians and veterans alike reflect on the story as an anomaly, a remarkable exception to the brutality of war. Yet, it also serves as a reminder that history is not only shaped by strategy, battles, and weapons, but by moments of individual humanity that echo far beyond the battlefield. For Ed, Karl, and all who bore witness to that miracle in the sky, it was proof that, even amidst the most harrowing circumstances, compassion can survive and even thrive. Through decades of teaching, lectures, and informal conversations with veterans, Ed shared the lessons of that day. He emphasized not the tactics, not the bombs, not even the heroism in combat, but the choice to value life, to recognize a shared humanity. He would tell students, audiences, and fellow veterans, the war taught us about fear, courage, and duty. But it also taught us that sometimes the greatest act of bravery is to spare a life when you have the power to end it. In turn, Karl Bosse spoke of the decision with humility. He described it not as heroism, but as a simple human reaction, an instinct to choose mercy over violence. Yet, the impact of that instinct was immeasurable. By sparing Ed, he had changed a life, a family, and history itself in ways that could not have been foreseen. The encounter in Germany allowed him to finally witness the fruits of that choice, to see that a life preserved had grown, flourished, and remembered him not with hatred but with gratitude. The two men, once enemies in the frozen sky, became symbols of reconciliation and understanding. They reminded the world that the human spirit can transcend even the most entrenched divisions, that old wounds can be healed, and that time, perspective, and shared experience can turn enemies into friends. Their story spread across media, inspiring countless people who read about the reunion, watched interviews, or listened to accounts of the encounter at the crash site. It became a story not just of war, but of the enduring capacity for mercy, connection, and forgiveness. As we look back on that December day, we are reminded of the fragility and strength of life. Ed's P-47 may have been a machine of war, but the decision of two young pilots turned it into a vessel of mercy. The frozen Belgian skies, once filled with the threat of death, became a stage for one of the most remarkable acts of human kindness in wartime history. And nearly 80 years later, two men stood together, proving that the choice we make, even in the most fleeting of moments, can echo across generations. In the end, The story of Ed Catrell and Carl Bosser is more than a tale of survival or a remarkable reunion. It is a meditation on courage, humanity, and the power of mercy. It is a reminder that even in the darkest hours, there is light, and even in the worst wars, there is room for compassion. Their friendship, forged across time and circumstance, stands as a testament to the enduring strength of the human spirit. And for those who hear this story today, whether veterans, students, or anyone seeking hope in a complicated world, it offers a powerful lesson that even in conflict, even in chaos, one act of humanity can change everything. One decision to spare, one moment of courage to act with conscience, can ripple through history, shaping lives, hearts, and futures in ways no one could predict. So when you think of the icy skies over Belgium in December 1944, remember this: 2 young men, trained to kill, chose to protect. 1 life was spared, and 79 years later, the men who once faced each other as enemies stood together as friends, united by understanding, mercy, and the extraordinary human capacity for compassion. This is a story of war, yes, but it is also a story of what it means to be human. It is the story of courage measured not only in weapons and missions, but in choices, morality, and heart. It is the story of Ed Catrell and Carl Bosser, a story that began over a frozen battlefield and ended in friendship, proving that even in the worst times, humanity can prevail. If you were moved by Ed and Carl's story, leave a comment sharing your thoughts or any wartime stories of extraordinary humanity you've heard. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon so you never miss another War II story that reminds us of the courage and compassion that history often hides.